I've been in the Dragon Ball YouTube game for a long time, raking in those hot DBBs, and if I know one thing, it's how many people absolutely love the translations, adaptations, pronunciations, romanizations of characters' names and terminology I use in my videos. It's fire. That is to say, people want to set me on fire, and I get that. Wait, no I don't. Why would you want to set somebody on fire over a children's cartoon? That's awful, don't do that. But I get some level of confusion and immediate lizard brain defensiveness when you're a fan of something being confronted with a term that sounds completely wrong to you, and you've never heard or read anything different. Imagine you were a fan of Sailor Moon in the 90s. Years later, you run into someone else who says they're a fan of Sailor Moon. You start talking about your favorite character, Usagi. And then someone who overheard your conversation wanders in saying she read the manga as a kid and she could have sworn her name was Bunny. And then things devolve from there. Ami, what are you, some kind of weirdo? Say it with me. Who came up with that? Did he even watch the show? One of them was killed, and at least one other needed therapy. Honestly, I don't usually see anything like that in the Sailor Moon fandom, but I do constantly see it in the Dragon Ball fandom anytime someone sees or hears, say, Kuririn over Krillin. Your entire late 90s latchkey kid identity has been challenged. But is it really worth getting that worked up over? Adapting Japanese into English can be a tricky business. There can often be multiple answers that contain their own levels of validity. There are sometimes compromises that arguably need to be made to be understandable to a certain audience. And sometimes people just make honest mistakes. Mistakes that persist for decades. That people defend to their dying breath, and then hurl abuse at you as if you're the one who's wrong! Okay, let me start over. At the risk of falling too deeply into a popular meme, a lot of Dragon Ball fans in the US don't seem to even be aware that there are multiple official releases of Dragon Ball in this country. If you've only ever seen, say, the Funimation dub of the animated series, you can go into any local bookstore and be confronted with the same names you chew innocent YouTubers out for using. Heck, you can pop in one of Funimation's own DVDs, switch over to the subtitled version, and find the same thing. So I thought it'd be fun and informative to go over some of the names and terms in Dragon Ball and look at how various entities over the decades have rendered them in English. And how I do. Hopefully it'll broaden your perspective and give you the smallest insight into what goes into adaptations between these two languages and what hurdles people can run into. And I'm going to try to do this in as simple and basic a way as possible. My university Japanese class from 2005 gonna be doing a lot of heavy lifting today. For the purposes of easing into this, to set the stage for how names work, let's start with a character that everybody agrees with. I don't think I've ever seen anyone argue over this guy's name. We have all reached a consensus that this is properly represented as Trunks. But what is this, literally speaking? It's a collection of 5 Japanese characters known as katakana. Spoken aloud, they are the sounds to, ra, ku, and su. Torankusu. That's literally the character's name, and I would never shame anyone who calls him that. So why is it not just Trunks? And if it isn't literally Trunks, what gives us the right to say that it is? Something very important to understand about Japanese phonemes is that there are independent vowels, but almost no independent consonants. In fact, we have that exception in this name, Outside of that, consonant sounds are paired with a vowel sound, represented by a single unsplittable character. Just look at the to. That's a single character. It takes us 2 letters to represent the same sound, because we treat each part as independent and interchangeable. That vastly changes how each of our languages can combine sounds together. It makes us quite a bit more flexible in that regard. It also means that when the Japanese language is trying to represent English words with their phonemes, it tends to end up with a lot of extra vowels. The fact of the matter is, as you've probably noticed, the overwhelming majority of characters in Dragon Ball don't have real person names. Instead, since Dragon Ball is a silly, silly place, characters are given the names of other words. Sometimes it is a play on that word, other times it is simply the word itself. Those names are often grouped into categories based on family or species or affiliation, and a lot of those names are pulled from the English language. You would think that would make this easy. And if you know the proper context, it can be easy. If you don't though, it's like a game of telephone. If you don't know how the game started, it could suddenly be a bit more confusing. If you just look at this with no context or experience, there are plenty of sound valid ways of interpreting it. How about Torankusu? Torankusu? Based solely on looking at this, trying to suss it out for an English tongue, those could be valid. But if you were to see the whole chain, you'd realize you're getting pretty far away from what it started out as. If you know his name is an English word, and you know that he comes from a family who are all named after articles of clothing, undergarments specifically, then you can put the pieces together and realize that Torankusu is the best approximation of trunks. And if you listen to the Japanese cast, you'll hear some of them elide over some of those gratuitous vowels.
Trunks? Trunks?
So that's basically how the process works. Let's try a similar one that isn't quite as agreed upon. And we don't have to stray very far to find her. It's our first character's sister. This is her name. It's Bura. Bu and Ra. So what's her deal? It's quite simple if you have the clues. English word, undergarment family, feminine, elided vowel. You don't even have to do much work on this. It's bra. She is named for the shortened form of a brassiere. And if we look at various English adaptations, we see that most of them get this. There's just one exception. If you're part of the Funimation dub verse, you probably know this character as Bulla. Bulla? Is that how they say it? I just realized I don't think I've ever heard it spoken before. What we would call the Japanese R is adaptable to both our R and our L. They don't have both of those distinct sounds, they just have one that's somewhere in the middle. So if you don't have the proper context, you end up with Bulla, which approximates the sounds fairly decently, but ends up moving far away from the meaning. In this case though, I'll give Funimation the benefit of the doubt that they were aware of the meaning but were afraid of using the word. There's a bad double standard where feminine undergarments are seen as inherently sexual, while their male counterparts aren't. So to avoid this sexual word for their children's cartoon, they looked the other way and pretended it didn't exist, going full English. Not all Dragon Ball names are rooted in English. Some of them are very Japanese. Some of them aren't strictly names, but titles. And some characters have multiple designations depending on who is talking to them. That brings us to this guy, who fits into all of those categories. He is first introduced as Kame Sen'nin. You've undoubtedly seen Kame written in English on his house. You've also undoubtedly seen Kame written in Japanese kanji, or pictographic characters, on the uniforms of his three main students. Kame is the Japanese word for turtle. Turtle is his theming. Early in the series, he wears turtle shells on his back. He associates with at least 2 different talking turtles. The other half, Sen'nin, refers to an enlightened type of hermit sage. As such, you could reasonably translate his title as the Turtle Hermit or Turtle Sage. The main English adaptations are more or less in agreement with that. For Japanese titles like this, Viz will alternate between leaving it as is as a title and explaining what it means in English. For Funimation's subtitles and dub, they both simply translate it out. The dub, however, rarely uses it at all outside of the beginning of the series, and that brings us to the character's other title. When the characters first meet the Kame Sen'nin, they think he's just some old pervert with a Dragon Ball. When he's reintroduced later in the story arc, they find out he's actually the Muten Roshi. That translates roughly to Heavenly Martial Arts Master. Here is where stylistic conventions greatly diverge. Viz follows their precedent with Kame Sen'nin. Sometimes they call him Muten Roshi, sometimes they translate it as Invincible Old Master, which is a slightly looser translation, but not too far off. The official subtitles leave it untranslated. And you may not know this, but there was a subtitled version of Dragon Ball that aired in Hawaii back in the day from a company called Nippon Golden Network. If you were trading tapes in that era, you more than likely came across recordings of their broadcast. They translated Muten Roshi as Ancient Wise One, which, well, I can see where it's coming from. So we have a lot of options. The dub, however, simplifies things considerably and just calls him Master Roshi, with Master as a title and Roshi becoming a proper name. That brings with it interesting ramifications. One is that outside of the dub, we never learn what this character's actual birth name is. He clearly has many mouthfuls of name, but they're all titles, so it's quite a departure for Funimation to treat Roshi as a real name. What's also interesting about that is if you break down the kanji in Muten Roshi, Mu is martial arts, Ten is heaven, and Roshi is Old Master. So basically, they're calling him Master Master. Maybe that's an off-the-point joke on their part, or Harmony Gold's, but I really don't think they were giving any thought to the meaning. You will see a few inconsistencies in how Viz handles this. They actually use Master Roshi once, as far as I've ever noticed. Then there's also this odd one-off where Goku refers to him as Master Muten. For the uninitiated, that seems extraordinarily weird, as if they just swapped in a random new name for him. Even if you follow Viz, it's largely inconsistent with how the rest of its product handles this character. But weird or not, I hope you can at least see now where it comes from. They translated the Roshi and left the rest. So it's actually more accurate than Master Roshi. The other nuance arising from this guy having multiple titles is that other characters tend to choose one or the other depending on their relationship to him. Non-martial artists call him Kame Sen'nin. Most of his students and student-adjacent characters call him Muten Roshi-sama, adding on a very polite honorific to the end. Goku, however, is the exception. Since he's not typically one for politeness or decorum, he calls him Kame Sen'nin no Ji-chan, or Old-Timer Kame Sen'nin. See? You can learn a lot about the characters based on the names they call other characters. Certainly more than with a one-size-fits-all Master Roshi. Next up, how about the one that turns everyone's head? This little guy. Here's his name. Kuririn. Kuririn. Believe it or not, most official sources have been in agreement here in just keeping his name as a straight romanization with no modifications or interpretive shenanigans. The Viz manga does, Funimation's subtitles almost always have, Nippon Golden Network did, I do. The only holdout is Funimation's dub, which has always used Krillin. And based on our journey so far, it's easy to see how it got there and why they would go that route. Kuririn does not flow that easily to English speakers. All you have to do is elide that first U and make the choice to go in the L direction, and yeah, there we are. I think it's a perfectly fine choice. Toriyama's actually been rather mum on the subject of what the character's name means, which is perhaps why I used to see far more variation than just those two choices. Given, however, that characters adjacent to him are all given chestnut naming schemes, and Kuri is Japanese for chestnut, it's almost certain that's what the Kuri and Kuririn is going for, which is why I choose to keep it. Others have suggested it's a combination of Kuri and Shaolin, as in Shaolin monks, and they go with Kurilin. I've seen some people make the argument that Funimation's Krillin is a reference to krill, tiny crustaceans, which fits because he's short. I think that's just a happy coincidence, but it is neat. I've seen Krillin in fan subs. Again, it's easy to see how all these come from the original sounds. Here's another wrinkle though. Toriyama Akira, Dragon Ball's author, often writes characters' names in English within the series. And I know some people who swear by these, that since the author wrote them, they're the only real English names. And I can understand that to an extent. After all, How can you disagree with the author? How can you say the author is wrong? Well, let's say you wrote a story and created a bunch of characters and then, for whatever reason, you had to present them in, say, Korean within the story. Maybe you wrote them, or maybe you asked someone to figure it out for you. It needs to get done, and most of your audience isn't going to be able to read it anyway. Look, you know where this is going. Anyone who's heard a horror story of someone with a tattoo on their body that doesn't mean what they think it means should understand that working in a non-native language is a task that is very easy to get wrong. So I tend to look at diegetic English text as a guide, but I try to take it with a grain of salt and a spoonful of critical thinking. After all, you strictly adhere to that, and you end up with this villain being named Sal. In this case, it's not all that bad. Toriyama very much writes Kuririn's name on his clothes as Kuririn. Once. A couple of story arcs later, however, it has suddenly become Kulin. Again, either can be fine, but if you're looking for the definitive answer, that's kind of impossible when the author provides two of them. Probably forgetting he did two different versions because the English text is not his priority. This is the character's name, everything else is just an interpretation. Let's get back to a character with a name based on a word we know in English. That's this girl. If you watched Dragon Ball Dissection, you might have seen me explain this one already. Her name's Biideru. So what's the telephone game here? Well, first off, her name is not actually a word. It's a heavily modified version of a word. Her family has names based around the devil, with her name specifically being a modified anagram of that word. Taking what we already know about vowel sounds and the R to L situation, we add to that there is no V sound in Japanese. B is used in its place. Because of that, we can see how devil becomes debiru through this system of approximation. You flip those sounds around and you get Biideru. Convert them back into their source sounds, and the big players are pretty much in agreement with how this should be spelled. There is a catch, though. You might have noticed that what I spelled there did not match the name I wrote at the beginning of this section. Biideru is not an anagram of debiru. I said it was a modified anagram. And here is what is modified. See that second kana? That actually is not a sound on its own. Instead, it attaches to the preceding vowel sound, indicating that it's supposed to be lengthened. The first vowel sound is changed from what it is in devil to a long E sound. You can very easily hear that in Biideru. The actors are very clear on that, whether they are hitting every vowel like Urawa Megumi's Ireza,
ビーデルの趣味は正義の味方なのよ。
or eliding over the extraneous ones like Nozawa Masako's Gohan.
ビーデルさん。
There are various diegetic spellings in the animated series, which can veer way too far away from the root word, and from each other, but at least one of them catches that elongated E sound. It's basically the same logic that gets us Vegeta's name. His name is a modified shortening of vegetable, which we don't typically pronounce vegetable, but the name is modified with that same extended vowel, which is why we don't call him Vegeta. And let's be clear, sounds are pretty cut and dry in Japanese. You can look at written kana and know how it's pronounced every time. There's none of this OUGH stuff we have in English. Because of that, I'd argue that while the Videl spelling is the best choice, Nozawa nails it. It's pronounced Videl. And that's where we're going to have some disagreement. Subtitles and manga don't have to weigh in on pronunciation, something I'm sure Viz breathes a big sigh of relief about. But the dub does. They, either by carelessness or by choice, treat it as a straight anagram, speaking it as Videl, with emphasis shifted to the end of the word. It sounded weird to me when I first heard it in 2001, and I admit it still sounds weird to me now. Then again, I almost never hear it. I've just started to develop an aversion to it over the years due to how many commenters love me over it. It just goes to show, even changing one sound can divide people into bitter camps. Speaking of bitter camps, there's no better way to wrap up than with this final example where I am very much the outlier with strong opinions. It's this character! Oh yeah, everything's been building up to this. You knew it was coming. It's all part of my plan to indoctrinate you into my weird weebiness. Whatever that means. Yeah, go ahead and boo. I've seen what makes you cheer. Alright, so this character. Her name is Buruma. This is one of those rare cases where the diegetic English spelling has really caught on. Yeah, people will easily choose to ignore this, and these, and our good buddy Sal. But when it comes to Bulma, it is ride or die. The dub, the manga, and the subtitles are all in lockstep about this one, and it's not that hard to see why. She wears that name on her clothes, one of Dragon Ball's most iconic outfits in Dragon Ball's very first chapter. And she wears her name on her clothes in English possibly more than any other character in the franchise. And like Bulla, it's easy to see how these sounds become those letters. So yeah, why argue with that? Well, perhaps you've wondered at some point, if we know what a trunks or a bra or a brief is, what's a Bulma? If the rest of her family is named after undergarments, why isn't she? Well, she is. She's the one who started the trend, but you'd be hard-pressed to know that based on this. See, Buruma is one of multiple Japanese approximations for bloomers, a name used for various garments worn in far more contexts in both the East and the West than this video really has time to get into. It could probably be its own video whether or not the modern Japanese use of Buruma has moved so far away from the 19th century that it could be considered its own word now. And that, of course, is kind of my point. Through various reasons, be it potentially Englishy text, as well as the evolution of loanwords and the objects they are attached to, there has been a lot of debate on this subject. And while the official adaptations have long since been in agreement, they have not been the only opinions in the history of the English-speaking fandom. Viz at least pays lip service in Chapter 1 that her name means bloomers, both in the dialogue and in its chapter name. That Nippon Golden Network broadcast from back in the day? They went with bloomer. Many popular resources I frequented back in the Wild Wild West days of the internet kept it as a straight Buruma. In more recent years, I took the lead from others who noticed that some, but not all, Japanese spellings of bloomers extend the final vowel sound so that it reads Buruma. A long ah sound at the end of the word is often used as a substitute for our ending which you can see bloomer has. It's the exact same logic that gives us Frieza. He's Freezer with the last sound chopped. And that's why for the last 10 years in Dragon Ball Dissection, I've called this character Blooma. It's bloomer with the last sound cut. To me, that's still the best compromise when it comes to both meaning and pronunciation. But given that other Japanese spellings of the word apparently don't use that extended vowel at all, I'm totally on board with bloomer or bloomers. The ambiguity of pluralization is a can of worms I'm not even going to open today. And I know I've been going on with this for so long that I've already gotten about 82 comments telling me I'm huffing copium to justify my weird pet spellings, and that I'm clearly exceedingly arrogant for daring to think I know better than the author. But do I? Allow me to present something I bet you never expected to see. A 2007 image where Buruma is represented on the character's clothing in English with a spelling that reflects the English word. Now, what arrogant weeb would draw something like this when Bulma had been well established for over 20 years at that point? It's the author of the series. It's Toriyama. He drew this. Again, I'm going to hold to what I said before. I take these examples with a grain of salt because it is that weird telephone game. Did Toriyama realize he'd been spelling it wrong all these years and decide to fix his English? Or had he forgotten how he meticulously and intentionally rendered it back in the 80s and just grabbed the first dictionary spelling he saw for this promotional image he really didn't care about? We don't know. I'm not trying to tell any of you to change or to shame any of you for what version or adaptation of Dragon Ball you like. I'm just trying to open your eyes to where these names come from, how fraught it can be figuring them out for localization, and that it's not nearly as cut and dry as offended YouTube commenters would have you believe. Thanks for watching! I hope this was as fun for you as it was for me, assuming pedantic analysis of sounds and spellings is something you find fun. Just imagine this though, if I had to remind viewers of naming conventions in every episode of Dragon Ball Dissection just to ward off comments, it would have taken me 30 years to get through the series instead of 10. This video by itself only covers 6 characters, and it's definitely over 20 minutes long. I could go on for another dozen videos and barely scratch the surface. That's just how big a topic this is. Maybe I'll do more. I don't know. In the meantime though, I would definitely recommend Herms' name pun roundup thread over on the Kanzenshuu forums. I'll put a link to it in the description. It's a fantastic resource if ever you're trying to understand a name. Kanzenshuu the website is a fantastic resource for anything and everything Dragon Ball. Maybe with a little more education and a little more understanding, we can all get along, even if we don't agree. And you can instead rally around harassing me over my opinions of the story, like civilized people. Who watches Dragon Ball for the story? Son of a...